Okay, in this video we're going to be talking about kind of an interesting idea. It's called the pendulum effect. Refers to both kind of in both social order type of effects and in political kind of effects. And we're using this as we're using the outcome of basically the political affiliation diamond as kind of an example, because it gives the best example of how to explain it, on at least on the politics end and even on the personal end, in a social end, of what ends up occurring with this. Now, in the top, in the libertarian end, that's basically where you get the most freedom with it. It should be viewed that this is basically you're not going to get any swing back. Basically, to view a pendulum is it swings back and forth. Now, traditionally in politics, it would the usual swing back and forth is between the progressive and conservative sides. Now, anytime it ends up going on the authoritarian side with it, it will swing back to the libertarian side. Now, it can swing a little back the to the middle with it from that, but it usually doesn't go back as it's not going to go back into authoritarian, and that's the only reason why it tries to swing back is because authoritarians will always try to grab back up power. These aren't necessarily socially groups of people, like large groups. These are just usually your groups of special interest with it, that usually do it either out of defensive means or other means with it, but usually those ones that do it out of defensive means tend to lower their things when you go toward more liberty, because they have no need to. Your ones that are basically just out for power with it will do it out of that with it, but they can't pull as much back when you tend to swing toward more liberty. So any type of authoritarian concentration of power is going to be essentially lost the more toward the libertarian you go, and it takes convincing of people that they need to give it up essentially during a crisis. Now, what we've seen, thus the terminology "never let a good crisis go to waste," which was used by Rahm Emanuel, who was I believe chief of staff for Barack Obama and former mayor of Chicago. And the reason why they use this is because that's really the only case for that happening. We've seen this tactic being used under the Trump administration. We've seen it being used under the Obama administration. We were also seeing it being done under the Bush administration, because anytime that there was a crisis, they were being able to slide to more authoritarian ideas. We saw the stuff of all of the under the Patriot Act, under the Bush administration. We saw under the Obama administration even more onerous regulations because of the continued war on terror and its continuation, and basically its crackdown on anybody trying to whistleblow on that. And then even more so under the Trump administration, doing the same thing, and also using the coronavirus to basically crack down on immigration. And and this is always the case where they always try to crack down on what ends up being both personal and economic liberty. And any time where there's essentially an opening where one of these people, where you get a leader in there that doesn't fall into this authoritarian. Now, Obviously, Kamala Harris is within this authoritarian type of group with it, but we see Joe Biden is not, as we've talked before. This is one thing where he tends to be on the between the border between progressive and moderate. Now, this is essentially swinging back, and this was something. This is why it's part of this pendulum effect. We were in the heavy in the authoritarian area. Maybe not directly because of Trump, but because of his advisors. So we swing back. We swing back toward this middle. Now, could we continue to swing forward? It's very, very possible because we're still not out of the thing of the of damage from economic liberty, and even though personal liberty has been massively harmed, this is only for the move of personal liberty, and people might essentially request more personal liberty during this time, and that can make an even further swing. Now, it depends on which party wants to go in that direction. Now, Republicans could easily go in that direction. Republicans have always had a closer link to libertarians because they've had historically a lot of ones that link in with economic issues, and they've had people even currently within their party that actually believe in both personal and economic freedom. And this could happen in which we get people that are going to fit this mold of being able to do this. And that we can swing into, at least on the northern end of this libertarian thing, or at least on this edge between conservative and libertarian right here. It just depends on how much they want to actually kind of like dump Trump's craziness and get away from this authoritarian stuff down here. There was in this region, there was basically on the progressive side of authoritarian, which is not anywhere near conservative. And so when we see with the pendulum, we see basically it'll swing traditionally in most elections, and it tends to swing back and forth because when you have basically economic turmoil, it'll tend to swing more conservative, where people are willing to kind of put to the side the need for personal issues being addressed. Then it'll swing back to being more progressive, where they're going to say, we're willing to put aside our economic issues and those things. Now, which ends up leaving, obviously, even though the libertarian would be the best solution, this ends up being a which would address both at the same time. What this ends up doing is it ends up swinging back and forth, where the moderate tends to be in the middle. You kind of halfway gets both, but it ends up swinging back and forth, and that's what you end up getting. Now, whenever you swing into this authoritarian area, what ends up happening is you'll end up swinging back in the other direction. Now, whenever you swing back in that other direction, it is much harder to pull it back, and we've seen this. We have evidence that it's very hard to pull it back when we see just recent changes, such as when they initially did the DOMA, which is in the 90s, which is a Defense of Marriage Act, which essentially basically created marriage as being defined as between a man and a woman. And once they got to the Supreme Court to outlaw it, which essentially allowed the same taxation rights, the same tax rights, and same rights overall with it for everybody, this ended up being essentially a liberty win for everybody overall. That ended up swinging more toward the libertarian end. Now, since that's been out of the box, even your authoritarian people can't put it back in. That's something in which is not going to be able to be put back in. The same thing when it comes down to the ideas of the movements to end the war on drugs, we've kind of have moved slowly away from it, and a lot of the states have taken over and been able to override what the federal governments wanted to do. And that's eventually going to get where the whole war on drugs is ended. And that's something in which the authoritarians want to continue. Even Trump accelerated it, and he's still what it called. And even though he accelerated it, states were basically at a rapid rate taking this power away. This was this pendulum effect in order. Now, when we start to view this, we need to view it as what's going to happen in the future of what's going to of this. Now, nobody knows if the pendulum effect is going to either go back to the left-right situation. Now, if it does with it, you're pretty much stuck with the same old going from progressive to conservative back and forth, which is going to be kind of the status quo of basically left and right. Now, it's going to be hard to judge if it's going to be going in that direction. Now, if it's going in that direction with it, you're not going to get much change. You're just going to be basically deciding from every 4 years with it which one you're going to want a little more. Are you going to want some type? Are you going to want actual people that are going to be dealing with getting more money in your pocket, or dealing with extending personal liberty, but taking more money out of your pocket for it? They're going to be charging for more personal liberty, or are going to be doing nothing about personal liberty, potentially might slightly harm personal liberty, but at the cost of more money in your pocket. And this ends up being this, or do you want someone who's going to essentially be doing nothing? And this is part of this pendulum on the on this cross axis right here. Now, on this up and down with it, it doesn't. What ends up happening is it doesn't really move back down with it. The farthest it can swing is this moderate area, because people are not going to allow it. People just naturally don't allow it to swing back to authoritarian. Authoritarians only can do this through what's viewed as a crisis. And what ended up happening was because of perceived things on the thing of the account of what was happening in certain areas, through a lack of economic gain. Trump was trying to tap into that, but the problem being was he never did anything, and his advisors had run a very authoritarian system, rather than actually using liberty to solve the thing. He was offering a lot of solutions. He was offering a couple statements that were basically liberty-based statements, which had lured in some libertarians, and that's what had gotten him the first vote. But when they saw the outcome of it, they found that basically it had nothing to do with it, with a lot of central control, which is authoritarian. They saw it was basically even worse than what Obama was doing in the authoritarian thing, where Obama was bridging between this progressive and authoritarian thing right in this little bubble here, which was basically what you were getting, and that was really right where we were at. And what he was doing, he was sliding it even further down the authoritarian level. And it was really not going to be much different with it. The only difference would have been basically between him and Hillary Hillary would have been a little bit more on the moderate. She would have been basically where Trump was about here, where Trump places around like here. Hillary would have placed around like here, being far more moderate, but still right dab in the authoritarian. And both would have been heavy authoritarian. So basically that's what that election was about, authoritarian or authoritarian. Because Trump allowed his whole platform to be controlled by his advisors, and his advisors were all authoritarians. That's what nationalism is, and that's the whole thing. And when you compare that with like someone who is naturally power hungry like Hillary Clinton, they're naturally going to be authoritarian. Now, when we start viewing, now what ended up happening in previous things, specifically when we start viewing like the 70s through the 90s, it traditionally was basically just going back and forth, this back and forth swing. Now, because the executives become so powerful, it's going to be looking at very, very erratic type of things, because we're probably going to be seeing an end to the two-term president, specifically because of the power of the executive. Because that executive has become so powerful that people are going to try to block it from becoming too powerful and being able to put in too much of an agenda. And that's what's happening with it. Now, until we get into probably this realm, people are not going to be very trusting of it. People don't want a strong man in the whole office. That's why with these people that are trying to bid for that spot, they don't realize they're only bidding for one term. And that's all they're bidding for. Anybody bidding for that thing, they're not going to be able to get back to this whole thing. People have already made their decision that they're not going back there. And it's going, and people are, and if we look even socially, you can even look at it on a social scale with it. Now, obviously, the statement saying that saying that politics is really behind everything socially, we can see things socially that there are a lot of differences, and we can see things socially that people want change to be far more on a liberal side with it, and I mean liberal in the terminology of being classically liberal, and such as the people have pushed for more. They want more free movement of individuals, because we've seen this push for things with it. There have been a lot more. You'll see a lot more talk of that, and we've seen the effects of that, because when the government has cracked down on immigration and basically the travel of individuals, we've seen essentially people have more of a thought to go in the extreme other event of saying people should have the free movement, all people around the globe, and come up with more ideas when it comes to specifically movement, as individuals are a global citizen. Not necessarily with it with other areas, but specifically with movement, as you are a global citizen in the idea of movement. And that tends to fly right in the face of what Trump was trying to push. Trump was trying to push this thing of being locked to your country. And that's something in which has become a much more new idea. And that's one thing to swing with it, specifically with immigration. Immigration was one thing. Trump is going against free trade. Now, specifically younger people, regardless of what you're hearing on mainstream media, the actual things are showing that free trade is very, very, very popular. In fact, we've actually seen numbers of, even in polls, show that free trade is actually increased by 80% on the actual popularity. And when I'm saying free trade, I'm saying total free trade, where people can actually make their own decisions. And that this even includes even some of those bad free trade deals. They really don't mind them. And but ideally, they want essentially zero tariff trade around the globe. They want these are complete and utter oppositions to tariffs. They want zero tariffs around the globe. They do not want. They want individuals to make their decisions on if they believe making a purchase of a product is beneficial for them or not. They don't want the government making the decision for it. And we're seeing this push as well. That's been a huge push with it. The push for free movement of people has been a big push. And these were essentially the tenets of nationalism. To basically, which is, if you go back, that nationalism is just basically the ideas of the progressive movement. It was nothing new. It was just basically going back to the ideas of Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, these types of people that were basically very, very bad for both economic and personal liberty. And we saw what happened with those back then. Is there was a definite shift in the opposite direction. In fact, with it, when you went directly after them, we saw a definite boost in economic liberty right after they left. And this is what ended up occurring. Well, now with it, because we have a larger impact of a global economy, we end up seeing what ends up occurring from these policies. These economic policies are very, very bad. And we end up seeing what happens on growth. Well, it's been the worst growth, actually, since we actually go back to just post this progressive era. When you start to view it via going back to just post the progressive era, we end up seeing that the growth of the real growth in the economy was actually the worst under this nationalism, even worse than Barack Obama, and that was something in which that at least the Republican Party could count themselves on. Now that they can't, they would have called this is going to be a very, very nasty type of thing, and that's why it swings back. That's why you're going to find it swinging back. I mean, they were adding as much debt in 4 years as Obama added in 8. That's why you're not going to find things, but they were not. And that's why when we're talking socially what we're talking is that socially there's things that are a lot different than what we're seeing things in the national news that they're trying to push, that we're finding on all sides of national news what they've been trying to push, which is basically criminalizing investigative journalism, trying to basically, which is going after people like Julian Assange. They're trying to basically make him out to be like some type of criminal, because the fact is your people in the mainstream media just don't actually do things with it. All they do, real news, all they do is they basically listen to whatever the state tells them to produce. We're seeing that they've also still embraced the status quo of stuff that's been there since the 1970s for these rules of stuff that people have been against. And we're seeing right now is specifically you're going to see a big push of things on the personal side that are just going to basically improve. Obviously, because you're going to see probably what the effect of this election is going to be. I'm doing this obviously before the thing's finalized. It looks like Loeffler is going to lose because she's down and they only have really areas to count in Democratic areas in Georgia, as well as Purdue is tied in Georgia with virtually tied with, and he was ahead by about 1,800 votes, with pretty much liberal areas left to count around the Atlanta area. And when you're only ahead by 1,800 and you still have those areas to count, that means you're likely to lose. And that means he's likely to lose that. And we know obviously what's going to happen. They're going to claim there's more voter fraud with that one. They're going to expect them to try to ask for voter recounts on that one, even though these people have to be sworn in, because these are recounts, and that you need to basically get these people sworn in and actually into Congress for the session. But what's going to happen is this is what ends up occurring, because anytime when you go away from your actual benchmark, you're going to find that you're going to have a negative impact, and even people within states that are because traditionally Georgia's viewed as a conservative state. Now, because they've gone so far away from that and they're aligning themselves with Trump, who is not conservative, who's authoritarian, his administration is. We've seen that basically they're embracing ideas in which are very, very bad for both economic and personal liberty, where conservatives should be at least moderate on minimum moderate on these personal scores for liberty, and they should be on personal liberty, and they should be very, very high on scores for economic liberty. They should be an ideal conservative, and a perfect conservative should have a personal should one that's kind of like smack in the middle of the conservative camp, should still have a good personal liberty, should have somewhat of a personal liberty score. Even if they don't with it, it means if they're really extreme on conservative, just only care about conservative, they're it means they're going to what it called be very, very still advantaged on the economic issues, which in the end are going to have some type of effect on the personal liberty, because there is going to be certain things that are going to be tying over. But when you start having those with it, you're going to have some type of a pendulum effect. Or at least if you have a mix of those two, you're going to have some type of if they're not necessarily having a bipartisan thing, but necessarily finding common ground, what you're going to find is that, or getting rid of the most extreme ideas, what you're going to find is you're going to find that you're going to be left with the ideas are going to be much more in this the libertarian camp kind of up here. They're just bracing into the moderate area. Now, this is why when we start to view what's happening in this kind of pendulum thing, we can see that if we moved from here out to here, we can see that the movement naturally with it is, obviously we might not in the next camp move all the way up here with it. That's a little bit insane to view that. But we can see that we're probably going to move into likely either into a moderate to the next time with it, to being a progressive that's basically to either a progressive or a conservative that's going to be a libertarian friendly conservative. It's not likely that it's going to swing all the way back, because people just overall are just not tolerant of what went on during the Trump administration. They're not, especially with the last two administrations, actually the last three administrations, they've been highly controversial. We're seeing specifically one right now in which the election of Biden is really someone that's not really controversial at all. The only controversy that's happening is someone that's acting like an actual child. I mean, I would utter some of the things that actually have been uttered on some of the podcasts from Reason TV, because I figure they're kind of funny with it, but I don't want them to essentially say, well, you've been using less than friendly language, even though they're quite humorous, and have YouTube get a little bit huffy. Even though YouTube would be more friendly for me kind of insulting a person that's basically acting like an actual child for losing an election. I mean, this is basically, he's doing this thing of saying, assuming that he won just because he won last time. And he doesn't understand that basically when you start to look at the election outcome is that areas that were affected negatively by his policies, and that they flipped because of that. And there were other states that probably should have flipped that were too embraced by his cult of personality that didn't flip. And that's really kind of why it was surprising. Because there were areas like Iowa that were very, very surprising that they didn't flip. There were areas like Ohio that were surprising that didn't flip to being Democrat. There were areas like Indiana that were basically negatively impacted by his policies that I'm very surprised it didn't flip. And when you start to look at like Texas, I mean Texas beyond a lot of and Texas to me is I think susceptible for Republican voter fraud. I've always been highly questionable about that. How does he win by more than he did in? How does Trump win by by a larger margin when we're just talking in percentages than he did in 2016 when he had a negative impact and he's actually dealing with a stronger opponent? That's one thing that just doesn't make sense. He had weaker weaker political ads. His political ads were not even targeting as well as they did, because what he did is he fired the person who was working on them, most likely because they were giving him notice that he's probably not going to win the election. And then what he ended up doing was when he did that, that's going to be a negative impact on the advertising schemes, and that was for web advertising. With it, there was a lot of web advertising that was kind of cut down for both candidates, and that's going to limit your outreach on the web for the certain areas, with specifically Twitter. And when they did that, that was going to eliminate a lot of the way you can deal with getting information out to people. Now, obviously, Twitter is a lot smaller than areas like, let's say, Facebook or YouTube, but there's still. But we found that basically, even with Facebook and YouTube, his advertisement was far weaker than it was in 2016. Any individual can actually tell you that. And yet we found that basically yet he won by a larger margin. Now, this would not make any sense if you're looking at it realistically. If you go against a stronger candidate and win by a larger margin, and yet your policies had a negative impact on the state. Specifically, there were actually a time when when petroleum actually went into the negative during your administration. This is the only time in basically in history I can actually note that this has ever happened. And specifically a state that relies upon the production of petroleum for one of its major industries, you would have to think that that's not going to be one positively that they're going to be viewing. Obviously, there's other things such as agriculture and some of the other things like this that they're going to be voting on. But that's going to be, as well as certain other types of industry. But that's one of the major things that actually runs the state, if not the number one industry. So when we see that that was majorly affected, they would have essentially been thinking that that's probably a way for them to think that it's going to be very, very negative. Now, obviously, his whole way to solve the whole thing, instead of cutting regulations with or cutting the ability for someone like Iran to sell all of their stuff around the globe, which would start to basically normalize oil prices and start getting more demand, and maybe start to get maybe start basically talk for people to normalize travel within the areas, and actually actually try to get things going maybe internationally. His whole thing was basically was to continue was to continue to aid the force of the shutdown. He was not bringing alternative viewpoints ever. He had someone like Rand Paul who was right there, who could offer an alternative viewpoint, yet he never allowed Rand Paul to speak on the national stage. He always allowed Fauci to speak, and then very, very late he allowed Atlas to speak when Atlas was considered to even be someone who there wasn't as much trust in. When he could have brought somebody like Rand Paul, who actually dealt with individuals with coronavirus hands-on, he could have easily done this. Now, if he would have done this would have put and removed Fauci from that post. Get some people who've actually dealt with these people hands-on. That maybe he would have and gotten several doctors to actually have done this and stated what the outcome is when you start dealing with them in these different treatment patterns, what the actual patients are looking like, that maybe he on coronavirus, that maybe he could have gotten that thing not to crash out. And this was happening actually early on in the whole situation, and because it was causing a huge lockdown, and that lack of travel was causing everything. When people don't travel, people don't buy gas. Gas causes a crash down. Now, if he wanted to also do something, he could have removed the federal gas tax completely, and say we're going to remove the federal gas tax, which would cause more purchase of gas, because you're creating a lowering of the price naturally, and which would cause it to go up as more usage, because you're eliminating another regulation on it. And this is one of the things that some of the things where he failed in Texas, why it would have been more likely that Texas would have voted at a lower number. That's why Texas was viewed as a toss-up. Now, this is where I tend to view that Texas is possibly where some voter fraud did happen. And beyond, obviously, what the actual GOP out there did to try and block access for and some of the public officials did to block access for a lot of Democratic stronghold areas to get access to votes. But even beyond that with it, I believe that if there is any massive voter fraud, it would be out there. Now, even beyond that with it, that's why when we see this, we're going to see when it comes down to this it's when you get this authoritarian like that attitude, it's always going to swing back in the other direction, and and the power never comes back. Even when we're talking socially with it. Now, socially, there's a lot of things kind of lingering on there, such as ending the war on drugs. Basically, people have wanted to move towards the free movement of individuals. This has been something which has kind of been creeping around, even though libertarians have been talking about it since the foundation of their party. This is something in which we can actually see a potential movement in this happening, and in which we can get people to basically move in here, and you're basically liable for whatever you want coming in. We're going to see kind of the end of protectionism. Protectionism will even though Biden is still protectionist in many ways, we're going to find eventually this is going to end, because as we see with the gig economy, people taking things like Uber as jobs, and people are very happy with them at very high rates, we're going to see that basically that is going to eventually take over, and people like these things. People like the freedom to take whatever jobs they want. People don't want, people have had, people sided with the idea of having the freedom to take whatever job as you want, as long as you're an adult, whether you have the freedom to take whatever job you want. Obviously, there needs to be some type of sign-off with it if you're a minor, and there's obviously certain jobs minors can't do. If you're obviously being under 18 that you cannot do. But when it comes down to other things with it, people want a lot more freedom to choose what they can and can't do with their money, with their body, with all these other things. And that's what tends to have a stronger and stronger push. And whichever of the two parties, being either Republican or Democrat, wants to actually engage in this is going to be the one that's going to end up grabbing more power. Now it's going to keep, because that's essentially the social push right now. And even though politics is behind society, that's essentially going to be the future. And it doesn't matter, these authoritarian think tanks can keep pushing what they want, but the fact is they're not pushing ideas in which are popular. We're finding more and more think tanks that are more and more dovish when it comes to foreign policy. And that's essentially what people want to vote for. So you can push as much money into being authoritarian on these, being war hawks in foreign policy, but it's not going to work because you can pump as much money into it. We've seen what happens when you pump money into things with it on these types of candidates. Because when Justin Amash was first sworn in, now he's obviously leaving Congress now on his own accord, and he could easily won re-election. But the fact is we've seen that, frankly, is that he could have won. He won on virtually no money, and he was not back. He did not back any. He's never backed any of these ideas of being hawkish. He's essentially been a victim of opposition of these groups all of these times, and yet he's been outspent in his campaigns. Yet when it comes down to it, is that he's always won in his campaigns. We've seen the same thing with Thomas Massie. Thomas Massie has been he was essentially primaried by one of Trump's nationalists. And this is out in Kentucky, just outside of Cincinnati, is where his district is. He was essentially another one that was primaried by one of Trump's nationalists. Tried to basically run as dirty of a campaign as possible, and yet he obliterated Trump's nationalist that was trying to basically run him out of office, just because Thomas Massie wouldn't go along with everything Trump wanted. And that's something in which we need to view as the future of what's going to happen, because Thomas Massie is far too on this conservative libertarian type of edge right here, and he's more in line of what's going to happen in the future. And what ends up occurring is you end up getting people who are against this authoritarian idea, and the people in the region voted, and they voted really one-sided, and even as much money as was ponied in. The future of politics with it is going to start local, is going to go national, is that people do not want authoritarians in office. And these authoritarians that might have won with it by ponying a lot of money with it, because they were trying to run on this whole thing of, we have to win to keep to keep Congress from going left or some like garbage like that. the whole thing with it is most of these people like Tommy Tuberville are only going to run one term, and Tuberville had the advantage of being kind of a high-profile former college coach. And when people realize that he really has just about as knowledge of the whole system of Congress as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, people are going to realize that they're not going to tolerate that from the right. And when it comes down to the pendulum with it, it's going to swing away from him. Now, people are going to go more in the away from that authoritarian, more toward a liberty-minded person. Specifically, in when it comes down to these states are going to go away from these things. And when you find people that are not going to tolerate it, it's going eventually it's going to be going across the whole country. People don't want these things, and it's 50 statewide. And it doesn't matter where you are with it. And to all the ones that are actually running against the idea of certifying the election, you have to think that if you're against that, you have to think that you don't have much of a shot of re-election. You're basically throwing that away right now. If you basically are doing that right now, you're basically throwing away your political career for some little thing of thinking that this Trumpism is going to last. And that's why when we look at the pendulum with it, it's not going to stay in this authoritarian thing for long under Trump, because Trump is leaving office, and people obviously are not happy with him. They voted him out. When they vote someone out, that means they're not popular. Mind you, with it, even when Trump won, he did not win the popular vote, so he was considered to be he was not even considered to be a very popular president to begin with. Only one never to win the popular vote, and it was considered to be a very, very tight race to begin with. Then when you have this one with it, he got killed in the popular vote. So he won kind of just barely with the Electoral College. That's why Democrats have been talking, let's get rid of the Electoral College, even though that was only an outlier that Trump won. Trump kind of ran on a policy of basically of targeting areas. That's basically what he did. Trump merely just targeted areas, and that's how he won. I don't know if he did it by accident, or if it was by people on his staff that were targeting specific areas they felt that they could win. But that's basically why he won in 2016. If you look at it from a political science perspective. And when he lost those small key areas, he was not going to win. Because the fact is, he won by basically attacking the Democratic wall up north. And when that was lost, that was gone. And that's why when we look at what's swinging politically, it's going to be swinging obviously in the opposite direction. Because it's already swung right here into this progressive to moderate area. It's only going to swing further as they start to listen to people. Now, it might not swing in drastic areas. It might swing over here on this area. Over here, it might swing a little bit further north with it. It might take a little bit of time from every 4 years, or at least every 2 years with it on the midterms. It might take a little bit of time for it to move. It might be swinging back and forth. We might go back to a horizontal pendulum and swing back and forth and slowly moving back and forth, and it might push the both parties kind of away from that authoritarian idea. But what it's going to do is eventually we're going to move back up north with it, because what has happened socially really since in what I think is about 2010 is that socially people have kind of tolerated less corruption and less abuses of their rights, both economically and personal rights. And it's been one thing with it. I think this is kind of what ends up happening when somebody tries to basically run a whole big hoax, and on the authoritarian end and at extreme levels with it, when you find two presidents directly, one going more extreme than the next, and what ends up happening, and you end up going a dramatic move. Now, this is why when I say we're probably not going to get a dramatic move as much, because we had a dramatic move because of how far we went down. And that was the reason why. Now, we're probably not going to get the dramatic moves in the future, but I doubt that we're going to be going in the opposite direction toward authoritarian. They're going to have to, essentially, you would need a crisis and someone willing to take advantage of a crisis for that purpose. And I don't think we're going to find that with as much as people are pushing now. We've essentially had 3 presidents in a row do this, and I think people have gotten to the point of being very, very sick of being abused in that way for their rights in that way, because we've seen this whole thing happen. I think people are going to get beyond this idea of thinking that Trump was our savior very, very quickly, realizing what ended up happening with those tariffs, with the things on immigration, how those things were actually positives for everyone, realizing how it killed the job market, realizing how it killed people's ability to move from place to place, realizing how what little those tax cuts added to your check, the tariffs just basically obliterated tenfold, because you were basically, if you got a little bit of extra money in each check, it was basically probably taking between during that month between 2 to 3 times that amount out in tariffs, and people just didn't like that. And I think what's going to happen is more and more people are going to realize that, more and more people that are still on this Trump train, because of all the QAnon fake stories, I think people are going to get off that idea and start to open up their eyes and realize things. Just like in the same idea what happened with Obama, where you don't find this huge Obama cult of personality like you originally did. Even at the level of 2016, you still had quite a bit of it. Nowadays, with it, you just don't find it there. You just find people that are just that end up finding reality out there and see, well, he expanded all of Bush's wars and he didn't do a damn thing. But a lot of those people were obviously the same people who voted for Trump, and are the same ones that believe in all those QAnon stories. And we find that basically those people are going to be realizing that and thinking that a president can be a savior. And what's going to happen is they're going to realize again that a president cannot be a savior. You just need to basically live basically on having more rights given back to you that were actually stolen. And that's the idea of what needs to happen with it. Socially, you need to be pushing for these things, and not basically saying, "Oh, this president's going to be a savior." Don't rely on that president to be a savior. Rather go out there and push for these things. To say the government has no rights to take these. When you start doing that, what's going to happen is the government realizes that it's going to have to move, and if they want to actually get reelected, because these things are, in their cases, high-paying jobs. They don't want to lose their powerful positions. And eventually what ends up happening is they realize that they just basically do the will of the people. They'll end up keep sliding up and up and up and up and up. And if you keep basically getting on them, that's what's going to happen. Because despite what they want to say with it, is they're really fearful of the people, because it's their job. They realize it's their job and their livelihood with it. They don't want to lose that. They don't want to be kicked out and basically become a nobody out there that everybody forgets about, because it just doesn't pay, and no one's going to remember some no-name congressman that served one term and got booted out because they didn't listen. They didn't listen, and when they were going for tyranny when people wanted liberty. And it's the more you push them in the opposite direction, the more you push for these special interests with it, the more you're going to make your life miserable. If you keep pushing for these handouts and all these other things like this, you're just going to push down to this more authoritarian thing. And this is the only way that they've actually been able to do it. And that's why they like their idea of a crisis, because it doesn't matter what they're pushing on the thing with it. They know that they can really attack these personal issues, economic issues with it. They're what it calls. They'll tend to maybe slightly address it with it, not usually, and that's for both sides. But when it comes down to the personal issues, they always like the crisis because they can really attack those. And to get back to anything with it, you really need people to basically say this is wrong, and really go after them. Economic issues with it, you just need them to start cutting spending, and that's why you need to also be out there with it. If you want basically economic equality, you need to go out there and actually study some of these things and actually look into some of the information, because currently with the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank, they feel that they can manipulate numbers to manipulate some factors that are completely unrelated. They feel that if they basically use inflation to get people to buy things faster, they can stimulate the economy. Basically, if they're basically causing more money to leave your pocket, they think that's a positive thing. Inflation is never a positive thing, as any sensible person would know. And as any sensible person would know, you can go see when the next new electronics device leaves, or the next new hot item leaves with it. There's people lining up down blocks with it to get it. You don't need you don't need to convince them to buy it. If they want to buy it, they'll buy it. If they don't, they won't. This is the free market at work. And they're also, when it comes down to it, they're also working to eliminate. They also want to basically use rates to basically get people to either spend more, or they think they can get people to spend more or save more, or in these certain things. Well, what happens when they end up cutting the rate of interest is they just end up creating a bubble in the stock market, because you can't gain money any other way than either that or through precious metals, because of really massive inflation. Because all you're doing is you're just basically shifting around money, and you're just creating this massive bubble. And those who are concerned about the bubble are putting it into precious metals, because of the real inflation that's happening. Because if you're keeping these rates below inflation, that's where they're putting their money, and which is a smart way to do it. If you you get the other ones who are trying to take advantage of the massive bubble as it goes up, and they're putting their money into the markets, and that's why the markets get huge. And when you get these politicians who go, I want the advantage of the markets because I can brag about it. I mean, we've seen people like Trump and Obama brag about about the Dow Jones. Oh, see how much the Dow Jones is going up, and with these things, this is merely just because the actual cost of money is gone well down. They're not even meeting CPI currently with it. They're actually buying buying both private and public bonds. Our Federal Reserve is, as well as which means that's quantitative easing, as well as which means they're monetizing both public and private debt, as well as what they're doing is they're actually adding to the problem by creating the interest rate, which is basically making cheap money that's below the CPI, or the government's view of inflation, even though the government's view of inflation is far below that of real inflation. Real inflation, since they've been doing all this process, has been roughly staying kind of on an average of about 8% a year. Now, the CPI on average with it has been staying about an average of 2% a year. Now, if we start looking at this, is we can see that that's a problem right there. Now, what the actual rate of what they've been, of what these bonds have been when you purchase one of these bonds is basically nothing higher than about 0.5%. So if you buy a public bond, you're basically you're not even matching up to CPI. And that's why when you put money into a savings bank, you're not getting anything. You can have a huge amount of money within, you're getting fractions of anything. And that's the reason why, is because they're basing it off of these rates, and these rates are nothing. And the idea is they think that they can rejuvenate things like the housing market and some of these other markets by having these exceptionally low rates. But what it's also doing is also having people not hold on savings, which is also killing people's savings and adding to a lot of people's personal debt. And as we've seen the effects of personal debt because no one has any savings during a time of a crisis to actually deal with anything that they can use to help them through if any catastrophe happens. And that's what we're dealing with right now. And that's what we've seen the effect of the actual Federal Reserve cause. The Federal Reserve is the cause of the crisis of this. They've actually created this whole crisis, making things more expensive to buy in the store, making like food and groceries more expensive to buy in the store because they're trying to get people to buy things faster, raising the and it's limited the market of who's actually in the stock market as well. Now we've had a situation to where you've created a wider definition between incomes just because of what they did. Income inequality is actually a direct cause of Federal Reserve policy. And if you would actually normalize interest rates, they'd actually do this. Now with the normalization of interest rates, which means actually not just going to CPI, but rather actually going to the real interest rates, which you can find at areas that list things like shadow stats, would actually show real things. Now you can't go to shadow stats directly because they charge for it, but there's other sites that actually list shadow stats as an actual source. And that would actually show you the actual rates, and it would show you that basically if we were to go to those things, and those rates are around what we were experiencing during the parts of the Reagan administration for interest rates, and that's basically to avoid massive implications. Now we've seen that basically because of the massive debt that we have, we can't do that, because that means that basically is at 8%, basically every $1 trillion every new $1 trillion that we borrow, we're adding another $80 billion of payments to cover new payments just to cover extra debt payments. But we're not only dealing with it. If we talk about that, is now you got to take that is on the just the current level, which is we're roughly going to finish somewhere on the level of like 30 trillion. You got to times that about by 80, which means if we were to do that, that would be about $2.4 trillion. And anybody who knows with it would know that that is roughly about 50% of our budget size. And that means essentially that half of our budget would be going just to service the debt. Not even pay down the debt, but actually just to service the debt. And this is why we can't afford that. And these are, as these bonds are coming in now, as we add more and more debt, that would be essentially, if we keep everything the same, that means we'd essentially have to find $2.4 trillion to cut from the budget. We essentially have to do a 50% reduction in every department. Now, there's certain departments that obviously could be full out eliminated. Certain parts of things that could be full out just totally gutted. And certain ones that could be cut down farther than that. But the fact is this would mean massive reductions in amounts of money that we'd be spending. And the fact is we don't find anybody that's willing to do that. This is why what the situation we're in is something that the Federal Reserve does not want to be dealing with. But every moment the Federal Reserve does this, and even if we stay at our level of the 2% CPI, which we know is not going to, which is about where all of our bonds are coming in right now, it's basically that's pretty much not going to hold, because the ones we're trying to sell out are at fractions of those prices, and those are currently not selling, so we're going to have to keep raising those up until they become sellable. And the fact is we're not going to find those bonds to be able to be sold. This is why when we look at things both in economic and personal issues with it, things are eventually going to come to where we're going to find on the economic side with it, where the whole system of fiat currency will fail. Our whole currency system is going to fail, and that's going to obviously open up a vacuum, as we've seen several small vacuums on personal issues open up, in which people have protested under to basically flip. We've seen every time there's a little small vacuum that opens up, it creates these things. Now, it depends on which way we go with it. We've obviously seen a mistake when a vacuum on certain issues have come up with it, where people made the mistake of going for an authoritarian. Now, could we go into the authoritarian idea of going to something socialist? It's likely, but with the idea of what other countries have gone toward with backing by gold, it's probably that to stay competitive on a global market, it's probably the idea that we're probably going to be going in that direction, regardless of what a lot of your other commercial banks have wanted to do. And this will force a lot of tightening in lending, and get back down to a honest monetary system. Potentially, basically back down to where when the government was saying to coin money with it, they weren't saying to print money. At worst case scenario, it'd be to print money and put precious metals within it, like how a lot of other countries around the globe are starting to do. And this is going to be part more of that what's happening socially. And the U.S. is right now kind of being forced to either A, enter into the global system of what's happening around the globe, or B, essentially be ousted from it and be essentially a pariah from the global system, from the global order of what's happening in these changes. And we have one of those two things that can happen. Either A, kind of be this kind of outlier and be kind of like this pariah nation that no one even pays attention to, or B, kind of join in and be part of everything else of what's actually changing both socially and economically. And it's going to happen to other countries as well, with it for those countries that don't want to basically play ball either on certain areas. And what was initially trying to go against the ideas of advancing for personal and economic things with it are actually going to go probably in the opposite direction, because people are getting very, very irritated with that idea. And this social pendulum effect is really starting to take effect, because there are only so many people that can push this authoritarian idea, and they only have, and even with people saying that with all this secret societies, there's only so many of them, and they only have so much. They only have as much power as you let them have. If you don't let them have any power, they have no authority. And basically, when you keep pushing with it, you're gonna eventually, because just by a matter of numbers, you're gonna have the ability to push them further away. When you don't prescribe to their ideas, or subscribe to their ideas, I should say, and you start going away from them, you're going to eventually, in extreme manners, what's going to happen is you're going to basically get them to move in your direction. That's going to move from this, instead of this swinging back and forth pendulum, that's going to essentially eventually get the thing to kind of, instead of just swinging back and forth, it's I forgot what the thing is called. Yeah, it's what is it, Newton's cradle. Yeah, it's basically it'll ends up acting like Newton's cradle. And eventually, it'll react where eventually we become like the center of on the Newton's cradle. I forgot what the thing was called offhand. And eventually, with it, what ends up happening is they keep hitting each other in on each side, and that's what's going to happen with it. Is that's what usually happens on each side here, is they keep swinging back and forth, and it tends to balance things out with it. But in this case, with it, we find that what ends up happening is they're going to is you don't really find as much of a swing back unless there's some type of catastrophe. Now, if there's no catastrophe, you can essentially just find that we would be the ones sliding across the movement. Is it would be closer to the idea of this, where you have one coming across and and once it comes back across with it, the only way where this would come back is if in the case of the some type of catastrophe that would that the government could take advantage of. Now, it depends with it how far this thing of authority with it comes with it, and obviously you see, the farther it swings back, the more energy it brings forward with it. That's essentially what ends up happening. The farther an authoritarian you go with it, it means the farther in you're going to get. Now, because we've had a lot of years of authoritarian with it, we're only able to kind of get a little bit back. But being that we are so far into authoritarian, into the realm, we're able to get up to moderate. Now, we might have only little minor steps going back up. It might be only small little steps, but eventually we will get there. Now, assuming that there is no catastrophe or people not buy into a catastrophe. Now, a catastrophe could just end up being another setback, and that's basically what we need to view as what this idea of a pendulum would be. Now, because but if people tend to view this idea of wanting all these ideas of social change first before they get there with it, this would put us far within this libertarian realm before we would ever hit that. And that would end up seeing this end up happening. Now, we might even see the idea of requesting that more parties have equal opportunity. We might request that as well, and without saying that we want this to happen for other, without them trying to pull anything with it. So we might say we want a dropping of that 15% rule. We want all parties on the stage because they want more choices, because there might be people that were kind of like disgusted with their choices and say, well, we want more choices out there on the stage. And we don't want anybody blocked from the election. We want all of our options on the stage. And this might, and that might be one of the future changes we might see as part of the thing. Within that could actually change some of the things that end up getting, and we can actually get further out there for full expression of the thing, of the ideas. Now because what we're seeing with it, especially out there, is while you find people that end up getting, they want to just basically hear themselves talk with it, we're seeing those types of things fail, such as like Parler. We're seeing groups like Parler where they wanted to just where they're grabbing a bunch of conservatives, but they couldn't get anybody else, and that's starting to fail because you actually need discussion back and forth, and because otherwise it becomes very boring. And that's how social media works, where you actually have interactions between groups, like actually mimicking society. If you just have like essentially like one group of people talking amongst themselves with the same ideas, the discussion gets really boring very, very quick, especially when you're only talking about one topic, on like specifically politics. If you're not talking about anything else, it gets boring very quick. And that's why what's going to happen is eventually you're going to need a lot more out there. And what's happening is people are getting sick of the choices and they're going to want more. Now, obviously, you're going to have people that want to remain with their old boring choices, but eventually with it, those people are going to die off. And those people that are there thinking, well, you need to be loyal to your party. We've seen those numbers with it is basically the overall general loyalty is about 20% for each of the parties, and about 60% that aren't. And even within those 20% that are loyal, even before this election, the amount that we had split tickets were about 85% split tickets. This meant that about 15% of the split tickets were coming from those 40% who are so-called loyal to their parties. That means about 7.5% out of the 20%, or about 37.5% of each party, is actually not fully voting down the tickets on their own party. That means only, we're talking 62.5% of each party on average is voting full-on ticket. This is something in which we're finding that even they don't have full-on loyalty. That means there's only approximately about 30% of the country which is loyal. This is before this election. Now, this election had an estimation of numbers that were even higher of split tickets. because they were concerned about the authority mix. And this is why this whole pendulum thing is very, very important. We see that people do not want people to take authority over their lives. And because if they did, we would have already gone back into full-on authoritarian mode without being able to control it. And this would have happened long before any of us would have been born. And that's why with it, even when we were getting back and forth on the pendulums for many years, on the progressive to the conservative side, that was not really, that showed that we were not having anything. And to see that we've only had a few instances of basically where I would say only pretty much a couple handfuls of actual presidential terms in which we could actually fully label as authoritarian. We could actually claim that that basically is that it is not a popular idea because it's only happened a small portion when we look at the history of our actual country. Now, when we compare that with, like, let's say, other countries that have had it, they've always had this idea in which they've had far more greater influence. Even the United Kingdom, who does have a parliamentary system with it, they still do have where the Queen can kind of take certain small authorities at certain times that can inconvenience their lives. And that is something in which we do not have that system. We do not have where someone has absolute power. And that would be something in which would be an authoritarian system. And that's why whenever someone basically claims that they have absolute power over something, you will see that they will be essentially voted out of office. And that's something in which we're finding with it. Whenever we find that with it, they tend to be removed. And whenever someone goes too far, and you're going to find with it that basically this is why the pendulum system works. If you go into that authoritarian with it, it's going to go far with it. Now, we saw that it go into the moderate area with it just in one election. That's just through a 4-year thing. Now, if it goes even further with it through the next election, we know what's going to happen, and it depends on how far you go. And I think Newton's cradle is basically a perfect example of it. Now, traditionally, it would swing back and forth here. Now we've seen the first time, I think, in a long time, of it go into this area of being an authoritarian within. We saw since that point with it the last time was during the progressive era, in which there was, through the next few presidents, that they had slowly actually moved in both economic and on personal liberty. On both those, we see that they had moved far more toward the libertarian end just within a few presidents from that point. And I think, and that was before there was a lot of ability for media to spread very fast. Now that media spreads almost instantaneously, I think we're talking it could be even faster than that. We could see it between maybe during this presidency, it could be during next presidency that we end up seeing massive changes. I mean, if it takes the one after that with it, I mean, we could see possibly within 12 years that we could see massive changes. I mean, this is what ends up happening when you go into those areas. When you go into those areas and go that extreme, especially in modern era. We've seen what happens, I mean, just even on an economic level, on a global scale for trade, what ends up happening to your country. If you go protectionism for even a very, within the modern era, which is really just from the 70s to current, we see what happens to your country. We saw what happened when to Venezuela. Venezuela, since the 70s, has been protectionist. We saw we've seen what happens to their country. Their country's in shambles, and this is what ends up happening when you go into that authoritarian realm. Your country is destroyed, and you will get people eventually that start coming up and start wanting to push in complete opposite realms. There's even people who have actually started to come up, who actually are starting to be libertarian within the realms of Venezuela. Now it's going to be hard for them to actually get into the system because of how it's controlled, but eventually that's going to happen. Eventually you're going to find vacuums within the Venezuelan system. And that's why what's going to happen here is eventually you're going to find, because of our mixed economy, the mixed economy is a failure. Everybody knows it, and eventually we're going to find that that people are either going to go in one direction or the other, either a fully controlled economy or a fully free economy. It's not going to be one or the other. It's not going to be a mixed economy anymore, and it's going to be happening very, very soon. Once it collapses again, you are going to be left with that kind of decision. And seeing that people do not tend to like their stuff controlled, and they're not very happy about that, I do not think we're going to go toward a fully controlled economy like we're seeing some of the socialists and some of the communists push for, because their popularity has gone down, as well as nationalists have gone down, are going to start going down in popularity. Specifically, they've gone down popularity in great measures globally. And that means you're left with one option. You're left with a free, and you're left with basically a free, a fully free and open economy, both domestically and globally, in which people are free to put their money wherever they want to without government intervention. And the thing's going to happen on the same idea eventually on the personal side, as we're seeing the personal go a little bit faster, because obviously not only do you have libertarians pushing it, but you also are starting to get progressives to push it, and you get some of the libertarian conservatives to push it as well. There aren't many beyond nationalists and these neocons and some of the moderates that are tending to go against it, but it's not going to go very long, because we're seeing kind of it start to push really hard. The next push I expect is to kind of push to this libertarian left movement. And while the Newton's Cradle is a good example with it, it doesn't tend to go into this whole triangular form, and that this is where we end up getting something a little bit different. Now, I think we're going to find next is, even though we might get to some economic issues with it, I think the midterms is in our next one, which is the 2022 election. I think we're going to go a little bit further, and I think we're going to start seeing some more personal issues adopted and pushed, and then we're probably going to see going across the aisle in the other way, just going directly across and going to more economic issues, and start seeing, because that's when approximately on the next thing with the next president is, the next president's probably going to push probably on that level. That's when you're going to see someone that's going to come in. It's not going to be a Trump Republican. It's probably going to be a libertarian conservative Republican that's going to come in and take that, because I do not believe that you're going to see anything swing back, because there's been such a rejection, and if you look at the numbers just don't show that there's enough of a push a lot of people just voted for him merely because he's Republican and because there's a lot of authority in the president right now. If Biden sticks to his promise saying that that the to limit the executive by basically saying that the executive gets his power from the people, and that the executive is limited in authority. If he sticks to that, what will happen is you'll see a little bit of a push to the progressive side, progressive libertarian side, and then it'll flip over, and then eventually you'll see it just slowly move up, assuming no crisis, as we said. I think that's about it. We're about at the 90-minute level with it. I think I don't want to push too further past this, and that's about it. Because we've gone over kind of where it means on both political and the social ends. Obviously, we didn't go into everything with it. It was more going over on the theory, and that's about it. And bye, everyone.